take a second and prepare a quad chart for Unit 2, the Great Arsenal. And our central question for this is, how and why did America enter World War II? There's an interesting quote here at the top, I think, from Admiral Yamamoto, who's the admiral who commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor. I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant. And when he was preparing this and he briefed it to the higher command and the emperor, he told them that if I am successful at the strike on Pearl Harbor, I'll be able to run free in the Pacific for 6 months, which is exactly what he does. After Pearl Harbor, it takes us a little bit of time to put our forces back into place in order to go after the Japanese Navy directly. But this is a very accurate quote by Admiral Yamamoto. He did awaken a sleeping giant. And I think never before and never since until 9/11 did we see the American population rise up against a nation the way we did after Pearl Harbor. But in the beginning, America claimed that it was going to be completely neutral. 70 to 80% of the American population did not want to get involved in World War II, particularly in Europe. But I think from an avenue of neutrality, we really didn't remain neutral because, like in World War I, we were profiting economically from what was happening other places in the world. And the way we were doing that is obviously by supplying armies. So by picking a side and supplying, technically we're not neutral, but we are keeping America out of it. And we did this a couple of different ways. Because of our attachment to Europe after World War I, and what drove us into the Great Depression was our own economy was tied to European economies because we were loaning money in order to rebuild France. So in supporting World War II, with those same armies, we told them they had to pay for anything they were buying from us in cash, and they had to carry it themselves. So cash and carry meant that they came with cash, they purchased whatever product or tool that they needed, and then they had to transport it. We weren't going to put our own shipping convoys in danger by transporting it across the ocean. And then another thing was lend-lease. With Great Britain specifically, we would lend them old World War I era battleships. And then in return for that, we could lease bases in some of the colonial empires that we had an aspiration to go to. And this cartoon really shows, exactly what America was going through, which was nothing, right? If you look at Europe, everything's going on in Europe. It's like all of them together, all of them are experiencing the same thing. But America is really, kept safe by borders of two great big oceans. And that's exactly how a lot of the American people looked at it. And if you don't know, I think this is interesting. Dr. Seuss, who wrote, several children's books that we all read as we were growing up, was really one of the big political cartoonists during World War II. And a lot of his books really show a lot of that as well. Japanese continue to expand their territory. We talked about in the mid-1930s how they started that expansion into China and Manchuria. And to kind of secure that on the same landmass, they signed this non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which is up here, right? And they are going all through China, Manchuria, and they're really trying to build this border of islands out around the Pacific to keep supplies coming in for an island nation. The final straw really for Japan is when they do this incursion into French Indochina as the French pull out of Indochina, which is Vietnam. The Japanese go in there and kind of take over with the same type of war crimes that we experienced in Manchuria, like the rape of Nanking. The United States responds by a trade embargo, which is significant to Japan because they receive 80% of their petroleum products from the United States, and we leave the Japanese with really very few choices. It's either got to defend itself or it's got to forfeit all the territories that it's taken since the 1930s. So this is what they decide to do. They're going to establish a defensive perimeter around their territories. That was that border I was kind of showing you in the last map. Exhaust American will with a long and tiring war. They know that the Americans don't want to be in a long, drawn-out, protracted conflict. And then they're going to annihilate the U.S. fleet with a single surprise attack that would cripple the naval forces. And that's what Admiral Yamamoto was talking about in that quote. That's exactly what they try to do. Yamamoto commands the Imperial Japanese Navy. He goes into Pearl Harbor with 2 separate waves of air attacks off of their aircraft carriers. And the result is striking. They sink 8 battleships, 11 destroyers, over 2,000 casualties, or killed in action, more casualties than that, destroyed 188 aircraft, many of those still sitting on the ground that never scrambled to go intercept those pilots, because at the time we weren't at war. Here's a map of Ford Island. Ford Island is here in the center. And this, if you've never been to Hawaii and visited Pearl Harbor, even flown into Honolulu, you wouldn't really see how close this stuff actually is. But it's a very small island, almost a channel that's through here. And you can see all of these ships lined up on both sides of the island, basically in docks for repair, or because people were in on the island. And it's literally shooting, ducks in a barrel. They could come in and just pass after pass after pass with very little defenses, really impose their will on the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor. But some things really that the Japanese didn't count on, or they didn't accomplish. One is they didn't plan on the attack uniting the Americans. At this point in time, that 70 to 80% of the Americans that didn't want to go to war felt that they were now drawn into the war, and they supported going to war with Japan. A major strategic failure was that they did not hit the United States aircraft carriers, which were out at sea. They hit old World War I era ships that were either scheduled to be replaced or repaired and sent back out. And then they failed to hit the power substations and the oil storage tanks that were on the island. So Hawaii is a big logistical supply base, not just a Navy base. Without that fuel supply and without those power substations to run the base, United States would have had to relocate their operations back to the West Coast near San Diego for about 1.5 years, which would allow Yamamoto a lot more freedom to run loose in the Pacific. Of course, this attack results in the declaration of war the following day, and then Hitler's declaration of war on December 11th, because he believes that the United States is inferior to both Germany and Japan. And that's true. At the beginning of this conflict, when the Americans get into it, we have the world's 17th strongest military. Now think about that for a second. Right now, we are the world's strongest military, not the world's largest, but the strongest, most technologically superior military in the world. But in 1939, 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, we were ranked number 17. We had 1 division of armed forces ready to go to combat. Japan has 100. Germany has 200. How on earth are we going to fight a war on 2 fronts? And our first actual engagement in the Pacific is a failed campaign in the Philippines. And the Japanese assault us in the Philippines with these objectives. They need to prevent American basing operations in the Pacific, and we had a base established in the Philippines. They need to establish supplying logistical bases to continue to provide this buffer around Japan. And then they need a secure line of communication between outer islands in the Pacific and the Japanese home islands. And that's exactly what they were looking for. So the Imperial Japanese Army assaults into initially Luzon in the Philippines, and quickly, within a month, has taken that island. General MacArthur is in command of U.S. forces at this point out there in the Pacific, and he's forced by orders to evacuate and relocate to Australia. So he takes his entire command to Australia, and he leaves Major General Mark King in charge of the soldiers left in the Philippines. And at this point in time, we start to see the American military and the Philippine commandos that we're working with are having issues with food, sickness. A lot of them have dysentery, so they're dehydrated. They can't keep any food down. Another common medical problem out there is dengue fever, which is spread by flies. Obviously, the Philippines is a very hot and humid environment. So the Americans and the Philippines that we were working with were very sick and not very much food and no logistical supplies. So General King goes to the local commander and surrenders. And when he does, he asks for humane treatment for his soldiers. The response from the Japanese commander is, "We are not savages. Of course, we will protect you. But he underestimated, I think, how many people that he was actually going to take under his wing. 76,000 Americans, a double number of that of Filipinos that had been serving with us. No way to care for them, no way to base them, no way to get them from point A to point B. So the solution is to walk them to the other side of the island, what's become known as the Bataan Death March, and situation that was devastating. If you think about what we talked about in the rape of Nanking, similar things with the treatment of a surrendering force happens to Americans and Filipinos by the Japanese during the Bataan Death March. There's a lot of literature on it, and there's a lot of people who have interviewed a few of the survivors that come out of that. And little things like during the march, when they would stop to take a break, the Japanese soldiers would sit in the shade and they would make all of the Americans sit in the middle of the road in the blistering heat. They didn't have any water. They would have to sneak away to get water at night. And if they were caught, they were executed. If they fell behind the pace of the march, they were shot on the side of the road and they were left there. The Japanese would go round up Filipinos from out of the villages if they thought that they were helping the Americans or the other Filipinos, and they would kill them. One interesting story about a soldier who had, with dysentery, couldn't really prevent when he had to go to the bathroom, so he stopped. They'd made the slit trench at night, and he stopped to go into the bathroom in that slit trench, and he slipped and he fell into that hasty latrine that was full of feces, and he sunk into it, and he wasn't strong enough to pull himself out. And the Japanese laughed at him and let him die and drown inside of that latrine. So just a horrible condition that also starts to really bring Americans back into the fold about why we should be fighting against the Japanese. This particular poster comes out in 1944, while the remainder of these men were in prisoner of war camps, but basically trying to emphasize the need for Americans to do something about this war and go get our people back. MacArthur vows to return. He's in Australia, of course, but he vows to return and liberate the Philippines as part of the campaign in the Pacific. The first major naval battle that we see in the Pacific is the Battle of the Coral Sea. It's the first major offensive and decisive victory. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Guadalcanal. I'll get to that in a second. The Battle of the Coral Sea is the first major naval battle in the Pacific, and it's a naval battle that has no direct Navy involvement. What I mean by that is that the two naval fleets don't see each other. So there's no direct battleship-to-battleship engagement, which is exactly what General Yamamoto was looking for and the Japanese are prepared for. So what this battle becomes is a battle of aircraft carriers and aircraft that are flying and spotting the opposing Navy, and they're dropping bombs, either with dive bombers or with some of their other torpedo bombers coming in to take out the Navy. It's a tactical Japanese victory because they sink more ships and more weight in ships than the Americans had sunk. But it's a strategic American victory because they stopped the Japanese from getting a foothold in between our supply route to Australia, again, which is where General MacArthur is located. So it happens kind of in this general area right here. And you can see Japan is planning to come in and get a foothold into Australia, knowing that our Pacific Fleet commander is there. And this battle, again, a strategic victory by defeating them and not allowing them to do that. Here's what we go into the battle with: 2 fleet carriers against 2 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier. The Japanese fleet, one of our major carriers is sunk, one of their light carriers is sunk. Again, it's kind of a draw, but in weight and numbers of ships, the Japanese did sink more than what we did. Next major battle of the Navy is the Battle of Midway, which this is, the Japanese are really seeking to find those carriers that they didn't get at the attack on Pearl Harbor. And they believe they need to do this because of what happened with the Doolittle raid. They'd taken those American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, and kind of as a psychological warfare attack, We flew those bombers in. We bombed Tokyo, and those bombers continued to fly into China, and I think one of them into Russia, where they had to find a place and crash land. A psychological victory for the Americans because the Japanese thought they were untouchable. So they've got to find the fleet out, and they choose Midway Island to do that. And we learned that they chose Midway Island because we'd broken their code. And there was a lot of discussion, at least back in the United States, on what their target was going to be. Some of the people in Hawaii that were listening in and determining what the Japanese were going to do, they picked Midway, but the big leaders in the Pentagon had other islands further out in the Pacific that they thought that they would hit, and that Hawaii wasn't a threat. So what these code breakers did is they sent a message saying that Midway was out of fresh water, that the water plant or water tanks, whatever that they had, were empty. So they intercepted a message back to the fleet from Japan in code that said, take water because the objective doesn't have any water. So based on that intercepted message, they knew that they were coming to the island of Midway, and they sent the fleet out there to intercept the Japanese there. Admiral Nimitz commands this fleet that is moving toward Midway Island. And Yamamoto attacks. So he does two things wrong. When going to Midway, the first thing he does is he splits part of his fleet off, and they go north to the Aleutian Islands just off the coast of Alaska. And they actually occupy one of those islands out there. But he doesn't have his entire force to fight at Midway. So the commander in charge of the remainder of the force at Midway makes a couple of poor decisions. One is that he's bombing Midway Island at the same time that the U.S. fleet detects where the Japanese fleet is. And he's just returned his planes, rearmed them with more bombs to send them back to Midway Island. And he makes the decision to bring the planes back and outfit them with air-to-sea torpedoes so that they could go after the U.S. fleet, which they now know the location to. And while those planes were on the deck of those aircraft carriers is when they were discovered, and they were initially bombed by American pilots. It takes 3 complete waves before anything happens to the Japanese fleet. 2 waves of bombers come in and miss everything, right? Miss everything. And then that 3rd wave of dive bombers comes in, and then they sink the majority of the Japanese aircraft carriers, and a significant defeat for the Japanese to give the Americans the advantage in the Pacific theater. Here you see what we began with at the Battle of Midway: 3 carriers to their 4 carriers. We sink all 4 of their carriers. We only lose 1 carrier. Causes of failure. Again, Yamamoto, we spoke about this, believes in the supremacy of the battleship. He thought that this naval battle in the Pacific was going to be fought side by side, battleship shooting at battleship, and the aircraft carriers really take the battleship out of the battle. Right, the aircraft would fly off, locate the opposing navy, and drop bombs and torpedoes, and that was the way that we really fought for the rest of the battle in the Pacific. Again, we discovered his plans for Midway, so we were able to prepare for that. So they lost the element of surprise. They use their aircraft in abundance to attack, and they don't leave any combat air patrol over the top of their carriers. After that first wave comes in and misses, they relaunch. So without that combat air patrol, our bombers were able to come in without anybody really trying to shoot them down and drop our bombs on those ships. And then finally, a Japanese blockade of 16 submarines arrived about a day late, and the U.S. fleet had already passed that area in the Pacific. So had those submarines arrived a day earlier, they would have detected the fleet, and the Japanese would have been given a significant advantage at the beginning of this battle. So the first major ground offensive in the Pacific is the Guadalcanal campaign. And again, this is where we see our first major offensive and decisive victory in the Pacific. Before this, the United States had this Europe first policy where they were only fighting in Europe. We're kind of playing defense in the Pacific and really allowing the Japanese to have their say on all of these islands, even after they attack Pearl Harbor. The president didn't want to get involved in the Pacific because he didn't think we had the manpower or the expertise to do that. Here are our key objectives. We need to find and occupy a staging base for future operations and amphibious assaults that allow us to go across the Pacific. Again, keeping pressure off of Australia, maintaining a critical supply line. That's a strategic objective, to maintain that supply line open for General MacArthur. And in the Battle of Guadalcanal, for the first time, we really see close quarters jungle fighting. This fighting requires inter-service communication and coordination. So the Army or Marines that are out on the ground must coordinate with the Navy for supporting gunfire and close air support coming off of those aircraft carriers. This small island takes 6 months in order for us to repel the Japanese. And you can see in this map, as we attack, the Japanese are both evading and counterattacking at times, making it very difficult for us to really push them off the island, something that I think we estimated wouldn't have taken but a matter of weeks, takes 6 months for us to accomplish. But the victory does give the president the belief that we can now wage war on 2 fronts. We can fight in Europe and fight in Japan. And we implement this idea of island hopping, which means we're going to take islands that are strategic in nature, that hold an airfield or something that we can use as a logistical supply base. We're going to do this as we go across the Pacific and toward the Japanese main island. But we're going to isolate the other islands. So we're not going to fight on islands that we don't need to fight on. We're just going to cut them off. They're no longer going to get supplies from Japan. And those Japanese soldiers, some of them stayed there for years later, never hearing that the war was over. We were only going to expend human capital and potential casualties on islands that we needed to take, that could take major bombers to land in on, refit, and then fly into Japan, with the ultimate goal of that last island we're taking being the Japanese home island. So the Japanese have all these islands, and they've got to make a couple of critical decisions on how to defend it. Initially, they defend these islands all on the beaches, which are very susceptible to airstrikes and to naval bombardment, which we would do for days before we would attack. That's how they fought early on. And then they started falling back and leaving less of a defense on the island, and then going more into cave complexes and going underground, which is very, very difficult and harder to fight. So we start to see an evolution in tactics in the Japanese forces, from a linear defense, a single line of defense, to a really complex defense in-depth system like we haven't seen before. And as we go forward through some of these other battles, you'll see just how in-depth the Japanese defenses were.